Well, good morning and good afternoon for some of us. Welcome to Beyond Compliance. My name is Aaron Bolshaw with Safety Chain Software and the moderator of Beyond Compliance. For those of you possibly joining us for the first time, this is a periodic industry update for process manufacturers, food and beverage, non-food. Our goal is really to bring you insights around the market that shape the way we grow our businesses, deliver quality products to customers, mitigate supply chain risks, safeguard our brands, and all while improving yields and maximizing productivity. Not an easy feat, certainly. Before we get in, very quickly though, I do want to make sure everyone is on mute. You guys, we can't hear you. We do want to hear from you though. So if you do have some questions, that's when you're going to use the little console on the right side of your screen there. Send us questions and we'll save some time at the end to get to a few of those. And we're going to stay flexible with our time, but we do plan to wrap up in 30 minutes today. So with that, I do want to introduce our featured panelist today, Mary Hoffman, Director of Food Safety at the Atchison Group, tons of experience in food safety and the quality program development and continuous improvement. I love that part of it. She leads a lot of initiatives to ensure food safety all up and down the supply chain for risk mitigation, including allergen control, environmental controls, monitoring, and behavior-based food culture programs. So that's why we're here talking with Mary today.
Hi, Aaron. Thanks. I'm happy to be here. All right, so we're going to jump into our conversation about food safety performance metrics. So this is a good time to talk about food safety measurements and to think about the impact that your targets may have on food safety behaviors. So I know a lot of time, effort, and expense goes into gathering data. You want to make sure that you really make it count and leverage those measurements to help achieve the food safety improvements you're looking for. Let's begin with a quick discussion about why it's important to set goals, to determine metrics, and to measure results, which is really not restricted to food manufacturing, like Aaron mentioned in the beginning. So a quick review of business management principles finds lots of references to measurements to drive results. So this "you are what you measure" comes from an article in the Harvard Business Review. And to make their point, they looked at why stock value was the main motivator for CEOs in large companies. And the answer that they came up with was CEOs care about stock value because that's how their performance is measured. So the article proposes that if we want to change what they care about, we should change what we measure. And psychologists and economists echo this idea with statements such as human beings adjust behavior based on the metrics they're held against. Anything you measure will impel a person to optimize his score on that metric, and what you measure is what you'll get. So in my opinion, in the food industry, most importantly is the idea that what you measure tells a story about what is important. So including food safety in the business objectives sends a very strong message from the top that food safety is a priority for the organization. And I want to talk a little bit about how food safety measurements are related to food safety culture. So sending a message that food safety is a top priority has an impact on the food safety culture at the company. When we talk about food safety culture, we frequently say it starts at the top. And what often comes to mind are things like the vision and mission statements of the organization. So including food safety in those statements does send a message that food safety is important. Just as impactful as those statements, or maybe even more so, are in the establishing and communicating objectives and KPIs related to food safety. So including a review of these metrics through your communication channels ensures that the entire team understands that food safety is vital to the organization's success. And because we're going to be using the terms objectives and KPIs in this discussion quite a bit, I wanted to take a minute to make a distinction between the two. So terminology might differ at your organization, but for the purposes of our discussion today, we're going to use these definitions here. So objectives are the results an organization seeks to achieve. So a quality example that's included here would be to reduce customer complaints by 5% from the previous year. Meanwhile, KPIs are the measurements that tell you if you're on your way to achieving your objective. So in this example, pick pack errors are a contributor to customer complaints. So this measurement can be used as an indicator of how we're doing in achieving customer satisfaction. So the main idea here is when setting objectives or goals, you need to consider the tasks or behaviors that are important to meet the goal. And to further emphasize how food safety program performance is related to food safety culture, I'm sharing a concept that was adapted from a paper by Jesperson and Wallace, and it's on triangulation and the importance of establishing valid methods for food safety culture evaluation. And I'm sharing this story because many of our clients ask us frequently, how do we measure food safety culture? So the idea from that paper is that a combination of measurements is needed to provide food manufacturers with a comprehensive evaluation of food safety culture, including insights into the variables that drive food safety behaviors. So the three areas of measurement are shown here. So these are a self-assessment scale. So that's like a culture survey that you might deliver to your team, along with semi-structured interviews, and then food safety performance documents, which are the focus of our conversation today. So these food safety programs provide insight into the documented food safety culture at your company. How well your most important food safety programs are implemented demonstrates the level of consistency, adaptability, and perceived value of food safety at your organization. So taking those measurements together with the survey and those interviews provides a balanced and comprehensive evaluation of your food safety culture. So when we talk about food safety program measurement, what specifically do we mean? Well, here are some examples of food safety programs that are very likely in place at our audience's food facilities. So these are things like cleaning and sanitation, storage and handling, documentation and record keeping, temperature or humidity monitoring, personnel practices, control of cross-contamination or allergen cross-contact, and the preventive controls as identified in your food safety plan. So keep in mind the focus areas for objectives and KPIs have to be really specific to your products, your processes, and the circumstances of your organization. So we can't really come out and say, here's the things that every food manufacturing company should be measuring. So you need to spend some time thinking about the food safety programs that are critical in your situation. Also, consider the areas where you think there might be gaps or opportunities for improvement. Remember that what you measure is what gets done and what tells a story, about what is important to your organization. So spend a lot of time on this. This is important to choose wisely. All of that being said, I do want to caution you about unintended consequences of setting targets. So when you're thinking about your objectives, think about what behaviors you may be incentivizing, either intentionally or unintentionally. We'll be talking about a few food safety program examples in a bit to finish out our discussion, but I want to set this up with an obvious example to make the point. So there's a phenomenon called the Cobra effect that goes back to the 1800s. And the story goes that the British Empire wanted to reduce deaths caused by cobra bites in India. So thinking the best solution was to reduce the number of cobras, they offered a financial incentive, or really a bounty, for every cobra skin that was brought to them. Well, people saw this as an opportunity to earn a quick buck, and they started farming or raising cobras. So when the government caught on to that and they removed the incentive, cobra farmers released their snakes, increasing the overall cobra population. So obviously the goal and the incentive had the opposite of the desired effect. So It's an extreme example, but I think it makes the point. it's important to think through the desired behaviors and communicating the whys of your goals as you set them and communicate them with your team. All right, so we'll talk through a few examples that are likely applicable to many food manufacturing organizations. So please don't dwell too much on the made-up target numbers. These are just for example purposes, and we're just trying to think through a consideration of this type of objective and how it may impact behaviors. So the first example given here is related to environmental pathogen monitoring. And we often see objectives kind of like this. So our objective is to achieve less than 5% pathogen positive results per month. Sometimes it's 0 pathogen positive results is an objective a business might set. And really at a business level, that kind of makes sense, right? If you're making food, you really don't want to have any pathogens present in your environment. However, if that's the only thing that's communicated, 0 pathogen positive results is good, you could have an unintended consequence of maybe selective evaluation of those sampling sites to obtain passing results. And I'm not trying to suggest that people are going to intentionally do this, but it could be something even subconsciously, getting a positive result is bad, might factor into where somebody is selecting to do their sampling when they're out in the plant. Obviously, the desired behavior is to seek and destroy. So if pathogens are present in your plant, you want to find them so they can be eliminated. So really almost finding a positive would be considered good, and if you look at it from that lens. So some ways to balance this that you might consider is through the key performance indicators. And if you can build some of those around your program execution, that'll be sending the message of the desired behaviors. So what I mean is, are you taking the number of samples you're supposed to? Are you taking the locations and zones according to your plan? Really, if you do find a positive in your plant, are you doing that thorough investigation, including root cause analysis, identifying corrective and preventive actions? And in doing so, does that result in a reduction in positives in that same location? So that can really help you get to the desired behaviors of find it if it's there and respond appropriately if you find it. Also, for each of these, there's an element of training or understanding of your personnel in their tasks and how they impact food safety and really what they're supposed to be doing, right? What's the expectation and why? So anything you can build in terms of training, in this example, do personnel understand the environmental conditions and where they should look to really seek how to perform their tasks and why it's important. So the next example is related to sanitation programs. And this is pretty similar to the environmental monitoring, but a little bit different. So we'll talk through this one too. So oftentimes when we're looking at objectives related to your sanitation programs, sometimes we'll see objectives like this that are related to sanitation verification activities. And like we want to obtain a pre-op inspection pass rate of greater than 95%. So similarly to the EMP example, we're sending a message that failing pre-op inspections is a bad thing. As you know, a lot of times the pre-op inspection might be made based on visual observation, which is a bit subjective. So we don't, again, want to send the message that failing someone's pre-op inspection is a negative thing. Rather, we want to make sure that we are effectively completing sanitation tasks, maintaining an environment to support the production of safe food, and utilizing data gained from those inspections to identify and implement program improvements. So some KPIs that could help balance this one out, again, are around program execution. So are we completing the tasks on our master sanitation schedule as prescribed? And are we doing those? Do we have proper procedures for each of those? Are they up to date and accurate? Are people following them? Also, if we do get undesirable results or trends, if your ATP numbers are starting to creep up, or if you do get some repeat failed pre-ops, are we responding appropriately to those? Are we going back to the procedures and making sure they're adequate? Are we making sure people are properly trained? Maybe even calling in our chemical supplier, if we feel like maybe a different solution is needed for an area. So coming back around to training and competency as well, making sure, again, everyone understands their role and why it's important. Okay, the next example is around food safety non-conformances or deviations. This is communicated a number of different ways depending upon your organization, but sometimes it's something like less than 5 food safety incident reports per month. That seems like a high number to me now that I'm saying it out loud, but you get the idea. It'll be low. We don't want to have a lot of deviations like CCP deviations or food safety incidents reported. So again, the unintended consequence could be personnel might hesitate to report an incident if it happens. And this is a big one to me. Food safety culture is all about what people do when nobody else is looking. So if I'm the person on the floor and I see something, but I realize I'm the only one who actually knows it, and I have it in the back of my mind that submitting a food safety incident report is a bad thing, and now we might not meet our target, that might incentivize me not to say anything. And that's obviously opposite of the desired behavior. So we want everyone to be empowered to identify, investigate, and resolve food safety issues as they occur and to prevent recurrence. So to balance that with KPIs, you might look at, some companies have kind of a near miss reporting system similar to what they'll have in place for personal safety. So if you see something that could lead to a food safety incident, let's address it before it becomes an issue. And then you're celebrating submitting of those reports and encouraging that behavior. Also, if there are incidents, and to be honest, there just will be, how do you respond to those? That's really what's important, right? So what kind of investigation is done? Are you doing a thorough root cause analysis? And if so, who's involved in that conversation? Do you have cross-functional involvement when you're talking about what happened and why, and solutions to prevent that from happening again? These things, then, you could be measuring their impact on repeat issues or similar issues of, the same kind of issue type. So again, the goal is getting everyone in the team involved in the conversation and involved in the solution. All right, another example is around third-party audit scores. So let's say our objective is we want to get a score of at least 90 on our SQF audit, and that would be an understandable goal. The potential unintended consequence is kind of complacency based on that score. You likely have your GFSI audit once a year, so it's a snapshot. That's probably a pretty decent snapshot of what's going on in your facility at that time. Very likely everybody knew that auditor was coming, and you kind of cleaned up the place and acted like your in-laws were coming over and gave the best picture of the situation at your plant. You really want to be able to use those findings to actively identify improvement opportunities. So some KPIs that you might use to balance this out are the scores and performance of your internal audit program. So we often say your internal audits really should be your toughest audits. You want to find things before somebody else finds them. So paying attention to the execution of that program. Are you completing all of the audit areas prescribed by your plan? And who's participating in these audits? It's similar to the conversation we just had, is the more cross-functional involvement you can have in the internal audits, the better, because then you're really communicating and calibrating to all different functions and levels what's acceptable, what's desirable, what are the expectations for food safety. And then, again, response to any findings of your internal audits, doing a thorough investigation, root cause analysis, corrective and preventive action, and does that, again, result in a reduction in repeat findings of the same type? And those programs, again, should be on continuous improvement. Excuse me, so anything you can measure and monitor in terms of how well are those programs delivering improvement to our organization, that's going to drive the desired behavior. And then I believe this is the last example, and this one's about training. So oftentimes we will see metrics around or objectives about food safety training schedule completion rate. Let's say we want to have that matrix completed greater than 90%. And that's great, and it's an important target, but you also don't want to rely completely on completion rate. You really want to understand the effectiveness of the training. So the desired behavior is personnel understand their role in food safety and why it's important. So in addition to, yes, did we check the box? Did we complete the tasks on our training matrix? Implementing some comprehension, some assessments of the comprehension of the training. So maybe you did a quiz after the training to make sure people understood it. Maybe you do some interviews with people to see really what they took away from that, or potentially you do some observations on the floor. Are people actually implementing what was trained? We also always encourage some supplemental coaching in addition to your formal training program. So you're not just giving them this message once a year in this big classroom environment. Maybe you're talking at team huddles. Maybe you have an informal food safety topic of the month. Whatever that looks like, those are some measurements you can include in your KPIs to really evaluate how well you're making sure people are receiving the training messages that you intend. Okay, so we're wrapping it up. I just really encourage you to think about your food safety measurements and objectives for the coming year. Remember that what you measure tells a story to everyone in your organization about what is important. Consider what is most critical for your situation and how you can frame your KPIs to encourage the desired behaviors. A lot of time and effort is invested in this, in measuring and recording and reporting metrics. So make it count with the deliberate and thoughtful objectives and KPIs that drive continuous improvement and food safety culture.
Yeah,
that is all for me.
That is awesome, Mary. Thank you so much. The story about the
cobra.
That's amazing. And these are things that have, it's an extreme example, but we see loopholes being generated quickly if you don't have a thoughtful, or mindful approach when you do create the KPIs, because you can actually encourage the wrong behavior. So I love that you went through these examples with this, Mary. This is fantastic. We do have a few questions. We have a little bit of time left, so let's just jump right in. Jacqueline asks, maybe do you have any examples of what food safety KPIs can be established for an import business? Are there any that kind of you can think of off the top of your head, Mary?
Um, it's a great, unique situation, but I would just say whatever food safety programs or processes you have in place, measuring the execution of those. So if you have a program that talks about how you approve suppliers or what programs you review, things like that, considering measurements of how well those programs are working would be my advice.
Yeah, and that's kind of that risk profile, Mary, coming in from your suppliers, right? So if you can get a scorecard and be able to at least understand an overall percentage risk-wise, risk factor, that's something that you should be able to do. Now, if you're doing these, Jacqueline, on spreadsheets, it might not be as easy, very time intensive. You can still get it done for sure. But if you do have a program, I know the Atchison Group has a supplier risk assessment program that's available. It does use the Safety Chain software platform to kind of execute upon, but there is a way to get a better scorecard in place for your suppliers that you can say, okay, now you can reduce your overall risk from X% to X%, right? That might be a KPI that's worthy of looking into. So thanks for that question.
Yeah, that's great. And that really also helps you focus your efforts, because unfortunately, nobody has unlimited resources. So understanding where your greatest risk lies so you can really focus your efforts there is very valuable.
Yep, absolutely. Christine says, very helpful presentation so far. Thank you. There are many influences outside of our control, in big quotation marks. So she's saying COVID, labor, supply constraints, things of that nature. How do we separate the influences we cannot control from the controllable metric data, which I think is a fantastic question. I don't know how to unpack that one.
I don't either. I was going to encourage you to go first while I think on that, Aaron.
I'll take it back. So any of these influences, right? When you've got a controlled process and you are measuring these processes against the norm, right, or what you expect, right? Your SOPs, et cetera, et cetera. When a new constraint or variable comes into play, that has to be able to be noted in some way alongside of the data. Somewhere you can say, hey, this thing happened weird because of this. Oftentimes we try to let data do the storytelling by itself, but it's just not enough. You need a space where you can control the narrative as well so that you give context to what's going on. So when you do a KPI, and I'm not sure which one we would be able to kind of point at, Christine, to make an example of this, but ultimately you want to be able to notate somewhere in the process of collecting data or measuring that data for the key performance indicator that says this other weird thing happened. And oftentimes an auditor will look at that as being a effective use of your controls, right? Because you're saying, hey, listen, there's something that is way outside of our control that's happening, but we want to just notate it. And that's the best advice that I can give, I think, Mary.
I think that's great. And the other thing that came to my mind was treating something like that kind of like a non-conformance, or non-conformance isn't really what I mean, kind of an exception maybe. Mm-hmm. And doing an investigation and consider what similar things might happen that we hadn't anticipated, and how can we get in front of that as much as we possibly can. So the same thing, kind of a corrective and preventive action sort of approach, mm-hmm. Thinking through what happened, what the impact was, and what similar things could happen that we could anticipate.
And that's a good point, Mary. Anticipation of these things is key, right? And we know there's a labor shortage and there's possibly supply constraints. Sometimes what you have to do is do that forward-looking analysis, if you will, maybe a loose word there. It can be as simple as a note or a memo to management explaining there's increased risks of your KPIs due to the following things. Getting eyeballs on it early is better than trying to explain it later and giving all that context. So we hope that helps, Christine. Okay, we got another one from Neil. We've got really great questions coming in, Mary, so let's take just a couple more minutes. Neil says, I look at companies' chemical invoices over last few years to look for major increases in purchases prior to audits. It shows if they are prepping for audits. I think that's a fantastic, not a question, but I think everyone should know. I'm not sure if Neil's an auditor or not, but that's a really interesting KPI that Neil's looking at. Are there a lot of chemicals being purchased right before an audit? Oh, watch out.
That is outside the box thinking right there. And he is really looking for behaviors. It's an interesting approach to try to understand behaviors. I love it.
I love it, Neil. That's awesome. So Krista says, we have been discussing lowering our ATP limits to help drive continuous improvement with sanitation. She's just saying, is there some unintended consequences that you could think of doing that, Mary?
You know, we always encourage you to do that. So I love that's the thought process, because you're using your data to drive continuous improvement.
Yeah.
Really I think just keeping in mind that at least during the introductory time, or, you know, when you're first implementing that, just communicating with the team what you're doing. We were at this level. We believe we can achieve this consistently. The only unintended consequence I can think of is if it turns out to not really be realistic.
Mm-hmm.
Then if you have all of these repeat failures, people are disengaged or frustrated with it, is really the only unintended consequence I can think of right off the top of my head. And that really can just be communication. Just communicate what you're doing and why.
Yeah.
And especially at the beginning of it.
Yeah, and then one additional point I'd put there is be careful, especially, so great example, if you do something that it's just absolutely unattainable, that's when you're going to start to see loopholes, right? But it's also, as in the case of the snake skins, if you incentivize, if there's a program or an incentive in place, or a commission or a bonus of some structure based on the performance of that, you may see some tomfoolery. So be careful when you structure incentive programs around these as well, because that's when things can get, you're starting to put the point of the improvement or the KPI improvement, instead of that being the primary thing you want to accomplish. The thing that the people will try to accomplish is the extra incentive. So careful on those incentive programs as well. And we've got something from Maxine here. She's been very helpful, or she's been very patient. Mary, Maxine is asking about audits, okay? And she says, can you give an example of scoring audits with the objective given of, earlier, plus 90%? And we wanted to kind of say, hey, give us an example, which audit? So she's talking FSSC 22,000. Can you give an example of scoring audits there? What are your thoughts on that?
So the example I gave is, you want your FSSC audit score to be greater than 90%. Mm-hmm. And I think she's asking what would be a better target, or maybe a more helpful target for an audit result from FSSC 22,000. And if that's the case, if that's the question, a lot of times we'll look at things like repeat types of observations. So even if you got a 92%, that still means you got a few debits on that audit where they're the same or similar debit types from last time they were there, which could imply that you didn't do a thorough investigation, root cause analysis, and really, really once and truly resolve that issue.
Yeah. I do want to say, Neil, thank you very much. Neil is also offering something else for an answer for that ATP question that we just discussed about lowering ATP.
Oh, great.
Neil was saying you might look at new technology like 3A swabbing instead of just ATP. So I wanted to make sure he got that got across to Krista as well. So I love it.
Nice. Love this conversation.
I know. So this is fantastic. This is great. Thanks, Neil. All right, well, listen, we're 11 minutes over. I do want to thank you again, Mary, for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, that'll end it for us today, everyone. Really appreciate you joining us.